The police car didn't come with sirens. It came with patience. A slow glide to the curb. A pause. Two officers stepping out like they were answering a call that made sense to someone, somewhere, even if it didn't make sense to the street. Aisha Carter stood on her porch and watched them look past the front lawn, past the house, straight toward the backyard, toward the garden. That was the first gut punch. Not the badges, not the car. The fact that someone had aimed the whole situation at the one thing that still felt alive. 8 months earlier, Aisha had buried her husband, Marcus. She didn't say it dramatically. It wasn't a story she performed. It was just a fact that lived in her chest now, heavy and quiet. Like a stone you carry without showing anyone your hand. The garden was Marcus's project. Not the cute kind, the serious kind. He had built raised beds himself, measured the boards, leveled the soil, set the trellis posts, so they wouldn't lean after one storm. He'd planted marigolds along the edge because he swore they helped. He'd made a narrow stepping stone path because he liked order, even in dirt. After he died, Aisha kept the garden going because stopping would have felt like erasing him twice. The officers walked up the driveway. Calm voices, routine questions. Their eyes kept drifting to the backyard like it was a suspicious object. Aisha answered, steady. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She didn't beg them to understand grief. She simply explained what any sane person would explain. It was a garden. It was maintained. It was on her property. It was quiet. It was safe. One officer looked at a clipboard. A complaint had been filed about an illegal structure and non-compliant landscaping. The caller was the HOA. Aisha felt that strange, familiar heat, the one that comes when a small power decides to make you feel small. The officers didn't cite her. They didn't threaten her. They left the way people leave when they realize they've been used as a tool for something petty. But the damage was already done. Because now, the HOA knew something important. They knew they could send pressure into her home without even showing their face. The next afternoon, the first fine arrived. Not huge. That's how they do it. $50. Just enough to sting, not enough to justify a lawyer, a landscaping violation, a note about community standards, a due date. Then a second notice followed. A higher fine. A warning about continued non-compliance. Then the big word showed up, tucked into the middle like a blade. Lien. Aisha sat at her kitchen table and read it twice. She didn't panic. She didn't shout. But her stomach tightened. In the way it tightens when you realize someone is testing how far they can push you. And she understood something else too. This wasn't about a garden. This was about permission. About who was allowed to take up space in that neighborhood and who was supposed to stay invisible and grateful. Aisha did what Marcus would have done. She got organized. She took photographs from every angle. The property line markers, the sidewalk view, the garden beds, neat and clean, the trellis, simple and sturdy, the path, the mailbox in the frame, the date stamps, everything. She printed the HOA bylaws and read them like a person reading a contract right before a betrayal. There were plenty of rules about appearance, plenty of rules about harmony and aesthetics and uniformity, plenty of rules that sounded nice until you realized they could mean anything the board wanted them to mean. What she did not find was a clear clause banning vegetable gardens. She also did not find a clause that allowed them to fine first and explain later. But the HOA was not playing a clarity game. They were playing a dominance game. The hearing notice arrived on a Tuesday. A compliance meeting. Mandatory. Failure to appear could result in further action. Aisha read it, then turned it over like there might be more truth on the back. Nothing. Just the same clean language that always shows up when people do dirty things. On the evening of the hearing, the clubhouse felt like a small courtroom built by committee. A folding table at the front, a few board members behind it, a stack of papers, a tone of polite authority. Aisha sat with her folder in her lap. The board talked about standards. They talked about complaints from residents. They talked about preserving property values. They talked in circles, because circles are useful when you don't want to land on a real rule. Aisha waited until they finished. Then she asked the only question that mattered. Which specific rule makes her garden illegal? The board didn't answer cleanly. They offered a vague section about landscaping. They suggested the trellis could be considered a structure. They implied the raised beds were an eyesore. They said the garden didn't match the neighborhood. Aisha looked around the room. She saw discomfort on some faces. Not outrage, not courage, just discomfort. People who didn't like what they were witnessing, but didn't want to be next. After the meeting, in the parking lot, a neighbor approached her. Denise, a woman with sharp eyes and a tired expression, the kind you see on people who've watched unfairness happen and finally decided they're done, pretending it's normal. Denise didn't make speeches. She just pointed to the pattern. One house had been complaining for a long time. A man who talked about property values like it was a religion. A man who acted friendly when Marcus was around, but changed his tone when Aisha was alone. Denise didn't say racism out loud. She didn't have to. Aisha went home, opened the latest letter again, and felt a clean anger settle into place. Not loud anger. Focused anger. The kind that makes you stop hoping people will be reasonable and start preparing to win. She went to the hall closet and pulled down Marcus's house binder. Marcus had always kept records. Not because he was paranoid, because he believed that a paper trail is a form of protection. Manuals, receipts, warranty cards, the closing packet, the survey, the deed copy, notes in his neat handwriting. Aisha flipped through it, half expecting nothing useful. Then she found an envelope with a simple label. Deed. Inside was a copy of the recorded deed. Clipped to it was a small piece of paper, folded twice, like Marcus had written it fast and didn't want to talk about it. Aisha unfolded it. It wasn't a love letter. It wasn't a goodbye. It was Marcus doing what he always did, even from the other side of absence. A warning, a plan, a shield. He had written that if anyone ever came for the garden, she should look up the recorder's book and page. He wrote the numbers clearly. Aisha sat at the table and held the note like it was the last warm thing in the house. The next morning, she went to the county recorder's office. Fluorescent lights, quiet lines, people holding folders that contained their whole lives. A clerk who had seen everything and looked bored by most of it. Aisha gave the clerk the book and page number. The clerk typed, clicked, paused, then nodded. A record came up, not just the deed, an addendum attached to it, a recorded covenant, filed and indexed, official, permanent. The language was dense, the way legal writing loves to be dense, but the meaning was clear. The lot carried a reserved right, a perpetual right tied to the land itself, to maintain food-producing gardens and pollinator-supporting plantings within the property boundary, including raised beds, trellises, and small accessory structures, so long as they were maintained in good repair. And then, the line that made Aisha's throat tighten. No homeowners association, present or future, could prohibit, penalize, or fine the exercise of that right. Aisha stared at the screen. Her hands went cold, because she suddenly saw what Marcus had done. He had known. Maybe he didn't know the exact day, but he knew the type of people. He knew what happens when small power meets a quiet household. He knew that grief makes you vulnerable. He also knew he could leave her something stronger than advice. He had left her a document that could not be argued with. Aisha printed copies, one for herself, one for the HOA, a few extra because she was done being naive. The next HOA meeting was scheduled quickly. Too quickly. Like they were trying to sprint to a conclusion before she could catch up. This time, there was an HOA attorney in the room. That told Aisha everything. The board sat behind their folding table again, faces composed, voices smooth. The compliance officer had a file open like he was eager to make the moment official. Aisha listened until the end of their summary. Then she stood. No drama, no speech, no shaking hands. She handed the recorded covenant to the board president, the compliance officer, and the attorney. She sat back down and waited. The room changed in a way people can feel, but can't always describe. The attorney's eyes moved faster. His posture tightened. He reread the key paragraph, then flipped pages like he was hoping for an escape hatch. The board president frowned. The kind of frown that isn't confusion. It's annoyance at reality. The compliance officer cleared his throat and asked where it came from. Aisha explained it was recorded with the deed and obtained from the county recorder. The attorney asked for the recording reference. Aisha gave it. The hearing ended early. Not with an apology, not with a humble admission. It ended with the vague language of retreat. They needed to review. They needed to consult. They would be in touch. Aisha went home and watered the garden, slowly, like she was telling the soil that it was safe again. 3 days later, a letter arrived from the HOA. The tone was different, still formal, still cautious. But the confidence had drained out of it. They stated that after further review, the garden was permitted. They stated that the fines would be rescinded. They stated that her account balance would be adjusted. There was no apology. There was, however, a subtle attempt to regain control. A line suggesting future structures might require approval. Aisha read it once, then read it again. She almost laughed, and the laugh surprised her. It came out dry. Because even while retreating, they were still reaching for the leash. Aisha did not take the bait. She didn't write an emotional response. She didn't beg for kindness. She called a local attorney, the kind of attorney who doesn't talk like a TV commercial. A small office, practical questions, calm voice. The attorney listened and pointed out something that made Aisha sit up straighter. Calling police over a civil HOA issue was reckless. Using fines when a recorded covenant barred enforcement was worse. The HOA had now sent a letter acknowledging the covenant's effect. That mattered. Aisha told the attorney she didn't want revenge. She wanted peace. The attorney said peace is easier when people learn that intimidation costs money. Aisha thought about it overnight. And then she did something the HOA never expects. She made it public. Not in a messy way, not in a ranting way, in a clean, controlled way. She wrote a post in the neighborhood group. A simple timeline. Police call. Fines, hearing, deed covenant. Fines rescinded. She included a photo of the garden in late sunlight. She included an image of the covenant paragraph with personal details redacted. She added one sentence about Marcus. Short and true. That garden mattered to him. It mattered to her. The responses came fast, supportive comments, awkward comments, people trying to smooth it over with talk about both sides. A few voices insisting the HOA was just doing its job. Then Denise commented calmly, with the kind of question that lands like a hammer. Why does harmony always mean certain people have to shrink? After that, the HOA started moving, not toward accountability, toward containment. They announced a policy update. Vegetable gardens could be permitted with approval, raised beds could be considered, trellises could be allowed if they met aesthetic guidelines. It was framed like generosity, but Aisha understood it for what it was. A scramble to make it look like they were still in charge of something they had just lost. Then came the real move. The HOA floated an amendment proposal aimed at tightening rules around non-standard landscaping. They couldn't erase Aisha's recorded covenant, not legally, not retroactively, but they could try to prevent anyone else from ever having the kind of protection Marcus had secured. Aisha felt that clean anger return, and this time it wasn't just about her. She requested HOA records, complaint logs, enforcement records, fines, legal expenses, the pattern behind the curtain. The board resisted, delayed, claimed confusion. Then, after their attorney advised them, they complied. The records told a story that was ugly and familiar. Some houses got warned for tiny issues. Others got ignored for big ones. Certain residents got fast fines. Certain residents got patience and courtesy reminders. Rules were enforced like a mood, not like a standard. Aisha didn't post the entire file. She didn't need to. She took it to a local reporter who covered neighborhood disputes and civic issues, the kind of journalist who loves documents and hates bullies. A short article ran. Not national news, not a viral explosion, but enough. Enough that the HOA attorney started returning calls faster. Enough that the property management company asked questions about liability. Enough that neighbors who had been quiet started speaking. People shared their own experiences, fence threats, trash bin fines, petty enforcement, fear of liens, moments where they had paid just to make it stop. It wasn't only about gardens. It was about power. And once that kind of thing gets daylight, it stops feeling inevitable. The next HOA election came. Denise approached Aisha one evening while Aisha was pruning basil and checking the trellis ties. Denise didn't flatter her. She didn't romanticize it. She said the board needed people who didn't treat the neighborhood like a personal kingdom. People who understood the difference between community care and control. Aisha hesitated. She didn't want a seat at their table. She wanted her home to be quiet. She wanted her grief to be private. But she thought about Marcus again, about that folded note, that book and page number, that quiet preparation. He had built her a shield. Aisha realized she could either keep holding it alone or she could use it to protect more than just herself. So she ran for a seat. She didn't campaign like a politician. She spoke like a neighbor. Clear, calm, specific, transparency, rule citations on every notice, no fines without clear clauses, no law enforcement for HOA disputes unless there was actual danger, a real appeal process, no selective enforcement. On election night, she won. Not by a landslide. not with fireworks, but enough. Over the next months, the board shifted. Slowly, stubbornly, the way old systems only shift when they have to. Procedures changed, enforcement tightened into actual rules. Records became accessible. Threats became harder to hide behind polite language. Some longtime board members resigned. One particularly loud critic moved away, and, almost magically, the neighborhood group chat got quieter. Aisha never claimed it became perfect. It didn't. There were still complaints. There were still personalities. There were still people who believed a yard was a moral statement. But something changed. The fear changed. The sense that the HOA could do anything, to anyone, at any time. That ended. One Saturday, months later, Aisha hosted a small gathering in her backyard. Not a victory party, not a public statement, just iced tea, folding chairs, soft conversation, the kind of afternoon that feels like breathing again. She handed out small seedlings in paper cups, basil, mint, a couple of tomato starts. People stood by the garden and asked questions, the way people do when they finally stop seeing something as suspicious and start seeing it as normal. Aisha watched the light move across the raised beds. She felt a sharp, gentle ache, because Marcus wasn't there to see it. But then she looked at the marigolds. He had planted them every year. He had insisted they helped. He had insisted on small things because small things are what build a life. Aisha realized the garden had become something larger than food. It had become a line in the ground, a boundary, a reminder that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is not scream. Sometimes you open the binder, you find the page, you bring the document, you let the rules break the people who were trying to weaponize them. The HOA had tried to turn her grief into a weakness. Marcus had turned their paperwork into her protection, and Aisha, standing barefoot in the grass, understood something that made her almost smile. In the end, the garden did what gardens do. It grew, and it changed the ground around it.